Okay, so this is the 6th lecture in the chapter on social psychology. And here I want to pick up on the topic of conformity and probably obedience. So this is actually a pretty cool little section. And the tasks, the activities that I have that go along with this chapter, with this section, I think are kind of interesting too. So I mentioned this in the very first lecture. Hold on here, I'm trying to get everything figured out. I mentioned that these back in the first part of the lecture on when I was listing all of the concepts that are going to be talked about it. But really, I just want to talk about the experiments that have been done on conformity and obedience. So in your textbook, so conformity is adjusting opinions, judgments, to match others in the situation. So you know what conformity means. But one of the classic experiments has been done with a guy on Asher's line experiment, and so there's a video on that one. And I remember when I was an undergraduate at K-State, in order to get credit for the psychology class there, you had to sit in on a certain number of graduate students' research. And the one that I went to is I was brought into this room, and I was one amongst a handful of people, and they would ask me specifically which lines, or they would ask me questions like which line is longer, which box is bigger, and then I was supposed to say which one was bigger. So what the Ash line experiment does is it puts a whole bunch of folks in a room, and it has them say, and the researcher asks which line is longer, which line is shorter, and the subject, the person that's actually being studied, he's the only one. Everybody else is part of the research experiment. So I was the only one in the room who didn't know what was going on. Everybody else was involved in the experiment project, and they would say that the short line was in fact the long line. So it would give the wrong answer, right? For instance, what's 2 plus 2, and everybody else in the room would say it's 5, and I'm like, I know it's not 5. But then what they were measuring was, would I go along with the wrong answer? Would, what your mom used to say, if all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you jump off a cliff too? And they're measuring what these projects are attempting to understand is, what are the conditions? Why do people go along with the wrong answer? Why do we follow behaviors that we know are wrong, right? When everybody turns left and we know it's right, most of the time we're going to turn left too. And why do we do that, right? And so what Asher uncovered, and so I've invited you to watch the video clip. He argued that there are 2 kinds of influence. That the reason people do this is for two reasons. One is what he called normative social influence, and this is a fancy word for peer pressure. We do what everybody else is doing because we don't want to stand out. We don't want to look like the weirdo, right? And we don't want to draw attention to ourselves. So if everyone says the wrong answer, and I have to say it publicly, I will also say the wrong answer because I don't want people to think that, I'm strange. Or the other one is, but see, there's a catch with that too. It depends. If I have to say the wrong answer out loud, I will go along with the group and say the wrong answer. If I can write my answer down, I'll write down the right answer as long as no one knows. If, however, there's at least one other person in the room who says the wrong answer like I'm going to say, then I will go along with them. So it's what we call, allies. So when there's an ally in the room. So it's like, if you've ever been in a class and you didn't understand what the teacher was saying, right? And you're like, I don't get this, but I don't want to raise my hand. I don't want to draw attention to myself. That's normative social influence. But someone on the other side of the room, they get the guts up and they raise their hand and they ask the question like, Sarah, we don't understand what's going on. And then Sarah says, does anybody else feel that way too? And then all of a sudden, all these other hands start going up. That's the ally effect. That if one other person asks a question, then you might also ask the question. That's why teachers always say, be sure you ask the question because somebody else is probably thinking the same thing. Right? Most of us will go, and that's what their research says, most of us will go along with the group, right? But if you want to change the dynamic, one person has to, and in sociology we call it deviance, but one person has to break the rules, and then others will go along. So that's normative social influence. The informational social influence says that The reason that I go along with the group, excuse me, is because I assume the group is right. Right. So if you've ever been, and I think I put a video up here, but one of the those classic experiments is they put people in they set people in like a dining room at a hotel, and then they pump in what looks like smoke, and they wait to see how long it will take before people get up and leave the room. And what they've observed, and there's a bunch of experiments that look at the same stuff. And what they've observed is that people will start to look around and be like, if nobody else is going to get up, I'm not going to get up either. They must know more than what I'm talking about. So informative or informational social influence simply says is that we trust the group, right? We assume that they know what's going on. It's what I always worry about when like there's an alarm going off at work and nobody leaves. Like if you're trusting me to leave and I'm trusting you to leave and we all just stand here, we're all going to burn up. Right. So anyway, those are the two, normative and informational. And then of course it really depends on culture. There's some cultural differences about conformity too. We live in an individualistic culture, which means we're less likely to conform, believe it or not. We are less likely to conform. When we live in a collectivist culture, we go along with the group. We just follow the group. We don't even really ask questions. But in a more individualist, say that collectivist cultures, they will publicly conform and they'll go behind doors and they may like say, ooh, should we have done that? Where in an individualistic culture, if we're going to dissent, if we're going to disagree with the group, we're more likely to do that in public. Along the same line, so Milgram does his work, I want to say in the late 1950s, and one of the things, so obedience. So, yeah, I was talking about Asher. Okay, that's right. So obedience, coming out of the Second World War, when we had so many people were killed in the death camps, there was a lot of social psychologists were trying to understand, like how could that happen? How do we prevent that from happening again? There are hundreds of people involved in exterminating these millions of people. Why did they let this happen? Didn't anyone try to resist? So there was lots of research being done on the role of obedience. Well, the first one, I think he's in the late 1950s, maybe he's in 1960, something like that. And him and then Zimbardo, who you will see if you haven't already in some of the videos, they happen to have they've grown up together and they're both social psychologists. Zimbardo is one of my favorite social psychologists. He is the guy that his research specialty is on evil. But anyway, Milgram is one of his would be the older generation. One of his, and he does this experiments called the Milgram teacher learner experiment. And you are invited to watch a video on this one and consider. And so what he does is he sets up a scenario where you're told the only person who's being researched, everybody else is part of the research team. But what you're told is that we are measuring learning, and the student is in the other room. And every time you're to read these word pairs, and every time the person in the other room gets the wrong answer, you're supposed to electrocute them. Well, the person in the other room isn't really in the other room, it's a big recording. So the student, the learner, is getting the answers wrong repeatedly, and you're to electrocute them over and over again. Well, every time they get the answer wrong, you're supposed to go up. You're supposed to electrocute them more. So the shock is getting greater and greater and greater. Eventually, because they keep getting the answer wrong, so you're moving on up the shock board, and these charges are getting harsher and harsher. Eventually, the person in the other room stops. They stop screaming. They stop making noise. Will you, subject, continue to electrocute them? And I don't really want to tell you the answer to that. I want you to watch the video. But a couple of the things that Milgram concluded, and by the way, this would be considered highly unethical and would not be allowed today. Universities wouldn't let him do this today because it really caused a lot of distress. But one of the things that Milgram observed, two of them that I can remember taking away from my undergraduate. One was, if you can diffuse responsibility to somebody else. So if I may not believe that this is the right thing to do, but if you're going to take responsibility, sure. Right? Like, you're responsible. If this guy dies over here, I'm not taking responsibility because I electrocuted him. I'm putting all that blame on you. When we can diffuse responsibility to somebody else, we'll do really harsh things. And when it's very clear that that person is a person of authority. When the person that is telling us to do bad things is clearly my superior. So what it says here is reassurance by direct authority. So if my direct authority figure, clearly direct authority figure, is telling me to continue to do harm, I will continue to do harm. And if I am not responsible, I will continue to do bad things. So Milgram said there were some certain dynamics, there were some certain situations that were that made people do bad things. Zimbardo takes that a step further, and he takes the conclusions that Milgram learned in his electrocution study, his teacher learner study, and he does the Stanford prison experiment. And maybe you've seen this. There's a documentary on Netflix. There's like a full-length documentary or full-length docudrama on it on Netflix. And what he does, they're both social psychologists. He sets up the basement of the psychology building, Stanford University, Stanford prison experiment, and turns it into a mock prison. He randomly assigns all these guys are of the same age, they're all white, they're all the same, background. He randomly assigns a group of them as prisoners and another group of them as guards. And he just steps back and says, there you go, just do your thing. And what he quickly observes is that the guard, now remember, nobody's done anything wrong, right? But very quickly, the guards start mistreating the prisoners, and the prisoners start having like nervous breakdowns, right? They start having emotional, vulnerable breakdowns. And I won't tell you any more of the details besides that. It's considered to be a classic, and this would also not happen today because it would be ethically and not legit. But I've tried to draw your attention to the big takeaways from that experiment too. And he says, it's not people. Like he did psychological evaluations on these young men before they came guards. It's not a single couple bad people, but it's the situations. And there are certain social situations that will make people more likely to act badly. And specifically, those situations are when there's a power differential, right? When it's very clear who's got the power and who doesn't. And when there's not any clear rules, right? So one of the things that the Stanford experiment said is that we hadn't laid out clear rules. We knew you had this role and you have that role, but in terms of like policies and procedures and protocol, none of that stuff existed. And so it's the situation that makes people do bad things. And then I don't know if you're old enough to remember the whole story about Abu Ghraib, which was a detention center in Iraq. And that video actually opens with some of the images from that in the early 2000s. And that was basically one of the things that the researchers wanted to point out is that the situation in Iraq was not because they were bad officers. It was because the situation did not lay out prescribed rules of conduct and rules of behavior. And I'm going to stop right here and pick up this in just a second.